She did it quietly. She did it in her own way, but she pushed the boundaries.
I'm Sari Mitnick, and this is Seamwork Radio, where we tell stories about the surprising ways that sewing impacts our lives. Just a quick note, this episode includes some historical quotes that have some outdated language around race, and it could be mildly offensive to the modern listener, just so you know. The year was 1917, and a young woman named Anne Lowe was arriving in New York for the first time. Back home in Florida, Anne was known as a gifted dressmaker and designer, creating beautiful gowns for society's young debutantes. Back in Tampa, she was a success, in high demand with rich young women. But now she was in New York for the first time. You see, Anne wanted more. She knew she was talented, and she was serious about her career. With a formal design education, coupled with her talent and experience, she knew she'd reach her dreams. But when she met the director of the S.T. Taylor School of Design for the first time, something seemed off. He seemed to be dismayed. She thought he might even want to send her away. You see, the moment before they met, he'd had no idea that Anne was Black. When she began her classes, most of the other students refused to even study and work with her. Anne was placed in a separate classroom, alone, where she had to work all by herself.
So she was put in a separate classroom, given the same assignments by the same professor in a separate classroom, and did her own studying over there, made the designs that were requested and everything. And by the end of that year, the professor was taking some of Anne's designs over to the classroom with the other girls and saying, look what she's doing.
That's Julia Fay Smith. Julia wrote a biography on Anne Lowe called Something to Prove. In it, she details the many times that Anne faced both personal prejudice and systemic roadblocks just because she was Black. And yet, she continued to break boundaries throughout her life and career as a designer, making incredible gowns worn by the rich and the famous, some of which were photographed and publicized around the world. She did things that many thought were impossible for a Black woman. In fact, things that seem almost impossible even now, given what she faced. And what Anne faced was both incredible success and devastating catastrophe. Both of those things, the high highs and the low lows, they came because Anne was a woman willing to take risks. Anne was inspired by a dream. It was a dream so strong, so a part of who she was, that she was able to do what few else could. She did the unthinkable over and over, risking her family, her career, her livelihood to be the person she knew that she could be, a great American designer. Anne's story starts in 1898 in southwestern Alabama. This area of the country was largely agricultural, and Anne was surrounded by poverty growing up. Her family was a little better off than most of the other Black families around her, so unlike most, Anne really never had to work in the fields. Instead, from an early age, Anne spent time with her mother Jane and her grandmother Georgia in their sewing room. Grandmother Georgia had worked as an enslaved seamstress on a plantation, as had her mother before her. She'd become free when her daughter Jane was young, and now mother and daughter worked together as dressmakers with their own business. And in that environment, where skills born from slavery were transformed into an independent business, Anne began to learn the art of sewing.
I'm sure they gave her many lessons on how to do this properly and so forth. But even before she could be given the lessons, she played in their sewing rooms. That was her playground. And so while everybody else was playing with paper dolls, she was playing with little dolls and making clothes for them from the scraps of her grandmother's and her mother's sewing. So while the other kids had paper, she had silk and satin and velvet to make little clothes with.
Although still just a child, sitting here on the floor of her mother and grandmother's sewing room, Anne began to form motifs that would remain a part of her work for the rest of her life. The family had moved to Montgomery, Alabama, a southern town full of manicured lawns decorated with camellias, roses, lilies, magnolias, azalea, and dogwood.
Montgomery is a beautiful town, especially in the spring and summer. Lots of colorful flowers. So she saw these flowers all over, and then she saw all this fabric on the floor of her playing room, and she started using some of that fabric to fashion tiny little fabric flowers. And this became a signature in her sewing forever. Every time she could put a fabric flower on something, she did it. She loved the fabric flowers.
Anne's bond with her mother and grandmother was her introduction to sewing. But it was loss that began her professional career.
When Anne was 16, her mother died unexpectedly in the middle of working on a commission for the governor's wife. And Anne knew at that point, if she didn't finish that commission and finish it well and to her mother's expectations and her own expectations, that she might as well give up sewing for the public. So she finished that commission and delivered all those gowns for the governor's wife and the governor's daughters and took the finished products to the governor's mansion. Everybody loved them. She was a big hit. And that was the beginning of her on without her mom's background, working for herself.
On her own now, Anne continued her mother's business, making dresses for the wealthiest white women.
There were women who were in the market for these really high-end dresses. They knew of their skills and trusted them and patronized them.
That's Elizabeth Way, assistant curator at the museum at FIT. Elizabeth's area of research is the intersection of African American culture and fashion.
So it's a society that really continued a lot of the dynamics, a lot of the tropes that existed within slavery. Because they were such skilled artisans, they had a very high position among Black people in that area, in that society.
By the time Anne takes over the business, she's been working alongside her mother and grandmother from the time she was a child.
She really understood how not only to make clothes of very high quality, to kind of create the designs that these women wanted, but how to not only run this business, but interact with the type of clients that she needed to interact with. Black women in the South have a very specific kind of relationship with white women in the South, especially at that time. And Anne Lowe wasn't just skilled in making dresses, she was very skilled in navigating those social dynamics.
This combination of skills, the hard technical skill of dressmaking, the creative skill of designing, and the soft skill of working with these clients, they'd be skills that Anne applied to her career for the rest of her life. But it wasn't long after she took over her mother's business when things really changed for Anne. She married, and she had a baby, her son Arthur. Her new husband really wanted her to stay home, and so Anne gave up her new career and turned to sewing just for herself and her family. It seemed her career was over as soon as it had started. But that's when fate intervened. Here's the story as Anne tells it. Last week, while in a major Montgomery department store, I felt someone's eyes following me. This is not unusual, for we Negroes are always watched when in public, but I often visit this smaller store, for I know the owners, and have never felt threatened there. Still, on that day, I knew I was being watched. Slowly, I looked around for some low-life man who might be eyeing me. There was no one. There was just me, an elderly woman leaning on her cane as she and a sales clerk examined some dismal-looking suits, and a smartly dressed white woman across the store. I went back to my browsing. Soon, I felt the eyes on me again. I could hear the sales clerk and the elderly woman deep in conversation. Still, I had the feeling of being watched. The well-dressed woman? Why? I turned as far away from her as possible, settled my countenance into a sweet smile, and abruptly turned to catch her off guard. Instead, she caught me off guard, for there she was, just 4 feet from me, with a genuinely sweet smile on her face. I must have looked startled, for she quickly apologized and introduced herself. Mrs. Lee from Tampa, she said. She wanted to know where I purchased my dress and hat. My world changed immediately. That was the story Anne told of meeting Mrs. Lee, who would become her benefactor and her supporter for many years. When Anne told Mrs. Lee that she had in fact made her own dress and hat, the woman invited her on the spot to come with her to Tampa and create dresses for her daughter's trousseau. Risky? You bet. I mean, imagine this for a moment. You've given up the career you love, the one you were born into and gifted at, and now you meet this perfect stranger in a department store, and she gives you the opportunity to move with her to a city you've never lived in, to work for her and her family, doing what you love. Would you take that enormous risk? Anne did. It was one of many risks she charged into in pursuit of what she loved. Anne said later in telling the story of meeting Mrs. Lee, "I left my husband today. I packed my belongings, grabbed my young son, and sought my freedom. My great-grandmother was enslaved, her every move controlled by others. My grandmother, for a good part of her life, was enslaved. I will not be. It is 1916. I will not be enslaved." And so Anne and her young son boarded a train to Tampa. Anne said, "It was a chance to make all the lovely gowns I'd always dreamed about."
That took a lot of courage, a lot of determination. And I think that speaks to what we see from Anne throughout the rest of her life, that she's willing to take chances. And she can look ahead and see what she wants in the future, and she goes for it and takes those big chances.
Anne's career soared in Tampa. She began making dresses for Mrs. Lee's daughters and soon expanded to creating gowns for all of the young women in their circle. It was at this time that Anne first attended design school in New York, sponsored by the Lee family. Mrs. Lee saw Anne's talent and wanted to help her build on it with a design education. That was when Anne tasted the racism of the North, a different flavor from that of the Jim Crow-era South. It wasn't something she spoke about much, even as she became more and more successful.
You'll find with a lot of kind of prominent people, especially in the mid-century, even going up from like the 1990s, people are very hesitant to kind of discuss the discrimination that they faced, especially when they reach a measure of success. I think there was a huge kind of current in American society that really encouraged Black people to be grateful for what they had. And especially if you could count yourself as very successful, there was not a lot of space that people wanted to hear you complain about discrimination that you've faced.
But Anne did face discrimination. Here in New York, she and her incredible talents were separated from the other students who refused to work alongside her. She was placed in a separate classroom, and she worked alone. Nevertheless, her talent shined. Soon, her pieces were being used as examples for the other students, and after completing the 2-year program in just 1 year, she returned to her home in Tampa, and she went back to what she did best, designing gorgeous special occasion gowns. Anne absolutely loved designing and creating elaborate gowns for events and special occasions. It was her thing. One of the highlights of the year for Anne must have been Tampa's Gasparilla Festival. Started in 1904, Gasparilla is a pirate-themed parade and festival event, so something like Mardi Gras in New Orleans. Imagine these huge parades through the streets, pirate ships on the water, big, lavish balls. So when Anne returned to Tampa from New York in 1919, the Lees were really involved in Gasparilla, and Anne began designing ball gowns, court gowns, and even pirate costumes for these week-long festivities. Her imagination and her eye for detail did not go unnoticed by the expanding social class in Tampa. And soon, Anne was able to open her own dress shop with 18 dressmakers as employees. She remarried, and she spent over 10 years in Tampa, building her reputation and her career. These ball gowns and cotillion gowns for society women were really Anne's bread and butter. Remember those early days of Anne's childhood, creating fabric flowers from scraps on the floor of her grandmother's sewing room? Adorning dresses with flowers, intricate pleats, beading, and well-placed flounces was Anne's style. She preferred the feminine and the detailed, a style that fitted perfectly into the part of Southern society that made up her clientele. Anne was happy. In fact, she described this as the happiest period of her life. And yet, she was getting ready to take another tremendous risk in service of her dream.
She knew that Tampa was not the design hub of the world, and she wanted to be where the design hub was located, and she knew that was New York City at that time.
Anne had managed to save $20,000 so that she could move to New York. Let's stop and consider that for a moment. The year was 1928. Imagine saving up $20,000 in that time. To put that in perspective, if we adjusted that for inflation, it would be over $300,000 today. Now imagine doing that as a female business owner. Now think about doing that as a Black female business owner. The odds would be stacked against you, that is for sure. But somehow she managed to do it. Anne took that $20,000 and moved from Tampa to Harlem. She said, I just knew that if I could come to New York and make dresses for society people, my dreams would be fulfilled. When her clients discovered that she was leaving, they were certainly saddened to be cut off from her talents. The Tampa Tribune wrote, "There is much weeping and wailing and maybe gnashing of teeth, to use the old expression, among Tampa society maids over the fact that Annie is going to New York City. Feminine society is wondering just how it will be able to survive the future social seasons without her assistance." But Anne was ready for the next chapter of her life. It was one that would take her to incredible career heights, despite the odds stacked against her. And it was also one that would bring repeated tragedy and misfortune. Coming up, Anne risks everything to make a career for herself in New York, and her career soars until 3 major tragedies strike.
Anne knew if she didn't deliver on this commission, she would never get another job in this society circle that she enjoyed sewing for.
This podcast is created by the team at Seamwork. We're here to help you design and sew your own wardrobe. You can check out our patterns, classes, and community by visiting us at seamwork.com. If you like the idea of creating your own wardrobe but really struggle with actually making things that you want to wear, check out our free downloadable sewing planner. It's available at seamwork.com/go/planner. It's a totally free printable PDF, and you can use it to help you create a small collection of pieces that fits your style and your real life. It'll help you to define your goals, create a palette, design some looks, and then create a queue of projects to sew. Just visit seamwork.com/go/planner, enter your email address, and then we'll send it to you right away. We'll also send you a series of emails that gives you some tips and actually helps walk you through using the planner. So again, that URL is seamwork.com/go/planner, or just check for the link in the show notes. Anne Lowe had built on the skills of her mother, grandmother, and great-grandmother to create a sparkling career as a designer for the elite society women of Tampa, Florida. But her dreams were bigger than that, and in 1928, she risked everything by picking up her family and moving to Harlem in New York City. It was soon after that that Anne's second husband left, and she was once again on her own with her son, Arthur. She wrote, "My husband left me. He said he wanted a real wife, not one who was forever jumping out of bed to sketch dresses." So with the crash of the stock market in 1929, and with a young child to take care of, Anne made ends meet by working for other labels in New York. At the time, the idea of superstar designers was more of a thing in Paris, but in New York, it was all about manufacturing.
So it would have been very, very common for the manufacturer to have their name on the label, to hire a stable of designers to do a number of designs. There were very few companies that were owned by the designer, that had the designer on the label, and kind of elevated that designer as the creative force behind the company. That just really, manufacturing was New York's strong suit, and so manufacturers had the power.
So Anne worked for labels like A.F. Chantilly and Sonia Gowns during this time, creating designs with others' names on the label.
But you were an employee working for a manufacturer. There are very few designers at this time, for example, Norman Norell, who was able to kind of leverage his popularity and negotiate with his backer, with his manufacturer to get his name on the label, but that was very rare.
In 1947, Anne Lowe designed the gown that Olivia de Havilland wore when she accepted the Academy Award for Best Actress for To Each His Own. But the name on the label was Sonia Rosenberg, not Anne Lowe. It's unlikely that the Oscar-winning actress would have even known who designed her dress at the time. Julia says that only a few years ago, she found a website that featured photos of every dress worn by every winner, with the designer listed beneath each.
And when it came to Olivia de Havilland, underneath the dress it said unknown. And this was after it was known, but they were still listing it as unknown.
Nevertheless, Anne continued to build her name and her reputation. She even managed to get her name on the labels for some designs she created for the A.F. Chantilly brand. But now, it was time to take yet another big risk. Anne opened her own design studio and shop on Madison Avenue. It's been said that it was the first Black-owned design shop on Madison Avenue, which is a huge accomplishment for Anne. Anne had faced down tremendous odds. She'd taken daring risks throughout her life in service of her dream and her talent.
I hope she had a glass of champagne that first night. hope she celebrated. Yes, it was a big deal for her.
At this point, Anne had a very select clientele. She designed almost exclusively for socialites and society matrons, women who were born into wealth, who attended debutante balls in their youth, and who continued a career of lavish parties, balls, and charity functions. These were women of extreme privilege, and it was a part of Anne's talent that she knew how to maintain relationships with them. Anne was clear. These were the women she wanted to design for. She called herself a, quote, design snob, and stated matter-of-factly that she designed for women on the social register.
She didn't want to design for me over, in the classroom teaching. She wanted to design for the Rockefellers and the DuPonts and the Bouviers and the Kennedys, and that's who she was designing for.
This allowed Anne to create the kinds of designs she wanted to work on. Lavish, top-quality, labor-intensive gowns that allowed her to stretch her imagination. And she took pride in working with these high-status, sometimes famous clients. But was there an element of exploitation here? Despite her many accomplishments and successes, Anne was far more interested in the creative side of her business than the financial side. She often underpriced her work, and some think she was taken advantage of. She was even referred to in the Saturday Evening Post at one point as, quote, society's best-kept secret.
Well, within their circle, she was the secret designer. Rockefeller would tell DuPont, DuPont would tell Kennedy, and so forth. But they didn't want to tell the outsiders who might steal her away and maybe talk her into moving to Washington or to another part. New York was society, but other cities also had society, Chicago, Cleveland, and so forth. And I think they wanted to keep her right within their little circle. Plus, that made her, I believe, more accessible to them. So she didn't have to say, oh, well, I'm working on a commission for somebody outside of the circle, It was within the circle, and they were thrilled to have her. They just passed her name among themselves.
But Elizabeth Way points out that it's not just a matter of her client's selfishness. Anne wanted a small clientele. She wanted to work within an elite circle. It was her brand, and it wasn't the kind of brand that would take out an ad in a newspaper.
She seemed to be busy enough with the word-of-mouth clientele, the word-of-mouth business that came her way, that she didn't really need to advertise. But I also think that dressmakers and others who do work with very, very elite clients tend not to advertise. That's not really what their clients want, someone who is making dresses for everyone. They want someone who's a little bit more exclusive. So I think it very much fit with the type of business and the type of clientele that she served.
For Anne, this was a huge part of her success. It wasn't just her talent for design that got her to this point, but her talent with people.
So she was able to attract that kind of support and build a network. That was something she did throughout her career. She built a network when she went to Tampa, and she rebuilt one from scratch in New York.
It was through her cultivation of this elite network that Anne took on her most famous commission, a wedding dress that is still well known today, but is one that nearly spelled disaster for her. This was the 1953 wedding dress of Jacqueline Bouvier to John Kennedy. Anne was familiar to Jackie's mother and was hired to create a fairy tale-style ball gown. Of course, Jackie Kennedy is known today for her sleek and elegant style, and some accounts suggest that she wanted something very simple for her wedding gown. But her mother preferred something much bigger and much more feminine.
Jackie Kennedy actually didn't like that dress. It's very different from the style that we associate with her during the presidency and her later life, but it was very much a sign of kind of her transition into independence. That was a dress that her mother picked because her mother probably had a huge say in picking all of her clothes for a long time. But she speaks really fondly of Anne Lowe and the memories that she had of kind of designing the dress, but that would have been very par for the course.
The dress was an enormous confection with an intricately pleated bodice and large skirt and petticoats, requiring over 50 yards of heavy satin.
I mean, can you imagine carrying around a dress that had 50 yards on top of the lace under petticoats and so forth and so on? I mean, it must have been horrendous on that wedding day to carry around something quite so heavy, but she did it.
Anne and her team of dressmakers created not just this dress, but the dresses of the entire wedding party. It took months of work.
It took her 2 months. She did that wedding dress and all the dresses for the wedding. Bridesmaids, junior bridesmaids and so. And she finished the dresses 2 weeks before the wedding. They all went home that night, she and her staff, and came in the next morning, and the dresses were all ruined. Water pipes had broken during the night and had drenched every dress, including the wedding dress, with water. They could not be saved. It was a total disaster. And as I understood it, gave her assistants 3 or 4 minutes to cry. And then she said, okay, the crying's over. We've got to do something about this. Because Anne knew if she didn't deliver on this commission, she would never get another job in this society circle that she enjoyed sewing for. So she went out and purchased same material, hired assistants, additional assistants to help her assistants, and they finished in 2 weeks what it had taken them 2 months to do previous.
Anne's team worked day and night to recreate all of their hard work in a quarter of the time. It must have been exhausting. But she did it, and finally, Anne took all of the dresses and brought them herself to the farm where the wedding was about to take place.
And when she got to the front door of the big manor house, she was told to go around to the back door, because that's where you go if you're a tradesperson. Go to the back trades door. And she said, if I have to take this dress around to the back door, no one will have a dress. The bride will not have a dress for this wedding day. So they let her in, and she and the dresses went in the front door just as they should have.
This dress was photographed and published around the world and copied countless times by other designers and brides. Today, it's the dress that Anne is most known for, but it cost her.
She was supposed to make, if you can imagine, that wedding dress and all the bridesmaids' dresses and everything, she had expected to make anywhere from $500 to $700 commission for all of that. Well, when she had to go out and repurchase everything, she had to pay for it herself. So that cost her $3,000. And the whole commission ended up setting her back a lot of money. She didn't tell the Kennedys. She didn't tell anybody except her assistants. She swallowed it, but what had been promising for her, that what she was going to make, she didn't make anything. That could have set a lot of people back, but she came through.
Anne actually lost $2,000 on this wedding. On top of that, she had to sign a confidentiality agreement, so she couldn't publicize her role in creating the dresses. This was intended to prevent people from trading on the Kennedy name, and Elizabeth Way says it likely would have applied to anyone, not just Anne. And Anne was quite used to discretion at this point. To her, discretion was just part of the business. But she was not prepared to read a piece in the Ladies' Home Journal in 1961 that referred to her as, quote, a colored woman dressmaker, not the haute couture. Anne was hurt, and she wrote to Mrs. Kennedy. She said, "You know I have never sought publicity, but I would prefer to be referred to as a noted Negro designer, which in every sense I am."
There's a lot of different, as we know, vocabulary around describing race, and that's always in flux, and that was not the term that she preferred.
But did this description actually come from Jackie Kennedy? Her secretary wrote back to Anne and told her that Jackie had not seen the final text of the article and hadn't known she'd be referred to that way.
A friend and scholar of mine, Margaret Powell, who unfortunately passed away quite recently, she was the preeminent Anne Lowe scholar. She actually dug through the archives at the Kennedy Library looking for this correspondence, trying to prove or disprove this fact, because it's a very kind of ugly kind of story. Margaret Powell was actually able to find that that was something that a publicist had written and given to a newspaper, that those words didn't actually come out of Jackie Kennedy's mouth. But Jackie Kennedy didn't, it wasn't an era where people were, walking down red carpets and asking, who are you wearing? So that information might be reported or might not be reported. And in Jackie Kennedy's case, there was not a lot of press around the fact that Anne Lowe had designed this dress.
Anne was also referred to as a dressmaker in that article and contrasted with the haute couture. I asked Elizabeth if Anne might have been insulted by that term as well.
In the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, dressmaker would have been an appropriate term. But it's really the terminology that changes more than anything else as we get into the 1960s. But one of the ways that she really kind of sets herself apart from kind of the average dressmaker is the way she talks about the creative process.
Anne dressed elegantly like Coco Chanel and was photographed in the style of a designer like Christian Dior. She very knowingly cultivated an artistic image rather than that of a tradesperson.
So she's very conscious in kind of building up these images of her professional life. But the term designer is something that kind of gets applied and kind of inserted into the popular American imagination in the 1960s and 70s.
In spite of the initial hurt, Anne still bore no ill will towards the Kennedys. Anne had Jackie's wedding portrait on the wall of her studio, and most of the people who were in the market for Anne's work already knew that she'd created that design. The people who needed to know, they knew, and that was what was always important to Anne, not public fame. Over the next 10 years or so, Anne designed over 2,000 dresses for balls, parties, and weddings. Anne absolutely loved her work. She once said, "All the pleasure I have had, I owe to my sewing. I enjoy it so much, I wish I were physically able to do all of the work myself." But in spite of all that work, creativity, and talent, Anne's business was suffering. For years, Anne had underpriced her work. Again, she loved the creation of the gowns, but she didn't love the business side. Her prices stayed low, and clients often bargained them even lower.
She did have a problem with underpricing her pieces, but also American design is getting a lot of competition from haute couture among the clients that she's serving. So the fact that her prices were lower was something that attracted clients to Anne Lowe. So there was, a couple of different layers going on there. But the business side, like many, many designers, that was not her forte and perhaps not really her interest.
Financial problems haunted Anne, but then 3 tragedies struck, and these 3 events would forever change her life and her work. For years, Anne's son Arthur had managed her business. He and his mother were close all their lives, and Arthur would often accompany her to events. He knew her business well and helped her to keep it afloat despite the pricing and the profitability issues. Then, in February 1958, the first tragedy struck. Arthur was killed in a car accident. Anne was devastated. According to Julia, Anne stated later that she never attended another party because her escort was gone. This led to the next catastrophe for Anne. Without Arthur by her side, her business suffered. Her bookkeeping was a mess, and in 1961, the IRS began knocking on her door. Anne not only owed about $10,000 to various vendors, she also owed $12,000 in back taxes. With her records in disarray, the IRS seized her business. Finally, there was a third blow. Anne's eyesight had been declining for years, and she finally had to have one eye removed due to glaucoma. The other eye suffered from cataracts and was at about 50% vision. Anne had achieved so much, and now her body was failing her. But when Anne emerged from the hospital after her eye surgery, she learned that an anonymous person had paid all of her back taxes. Anne suspected that this anonymous friend was Jackie Kennedy, but she never knew for certain. Now, you might think at this point, retirement would really be the only option. But Anne loved her work, and she continued designing for both other labels and under her own name. She lived with her sister Sally, who assisted her in the business. Anne would describe what she wanted, and Sally would direct the dressmakers in creating it. In 1968, Anne designed what had come to be known as her swan song dress, a wedding dress designed for a young woman named Elizabeth Mance. Julia Fay Smith describes it this way in her book. The dress, made of lace imported from Switzerland, featured sheer long sleeves, delicate flowers around the portrait neckline, and a long, billowing train of lace. The train fell from a headpiece designed with lace flowers designed by Anne and sewn into Elizabeth's hair. Matching flowers were hand-sewn onto the 5 yards of the train. But what made this dress most meaningful for Anne is that at the age of 69, it was the first wedding dress she had designed for a Black woman. For years, Anne had catered to an elite white clientele that kept her name amongst themselves. Elizabeth Way points out that by this time, Anne had gained more national notoriety and was no longer such a well-kept secret. She'd been featured not only in national magazines like the Saturday Evening Post, but in a large feature in Ebony magazine in 1966.
It was after she reached a more national prominence, she appeared on television as well, that probably elite Black people even knew of her and knew to contact her and commission her work. So I think that probably had a lot more to do with it than anything else. Of course, we start to see, there have always been rich Black people in the United States, but I think that was something that probably meant a lot to that bride and her family, that someone as elite as Anne Lowe, who would have been making dresses for first ladies and such, would make her wedding gown as well. That was probably a sign of status for them, just like an Anne Lowe dress was a sign of status for her white clients.
Anne was able to attend the wedding and watch Elizabeth dance in this very special gown. It was a sign of the times. Anne had used her amazing talent for decades to create lavish and luxurious gowns for the most privileged white women. Now she was watching this beautiful young Black woman, who was, by the way, a talented musician herself. She took center stage in this wedding gown that was fit for a princess. In so many ways, Anne lived and worked in transition. Her gowns, with their Southern charm and sweet details, hearkened to the past even as the world changed. She embraced the role of the hardworking dressmaker, the inheritance of her once enslaved mother, grandmother, and great-grandmother. But she also embraced the role of the modern designer, crafting an image of herself as an elegant artist and building her own brand. When she first came to New York in 1917, she wasn't even allowed to work in the same room as her white peers. Now, at the end of her career, well known as an elite dress designer, she watched Elizabeth dance in her swan song gown. It was risk that brought Anne here, risks that she was willing to take because she believed in herself and in her dream. That dream propelled her through all the many obstacles that were placed before her. She wanted to be a great designer, and she was. Anne's story is a story of courage. Today, as we live through another moment of great transition, there are people just like Anne who are taking risks and they're pushing boundaries. They're the ones opening doors, and they're the ones creating a lasting legacy. Thank you to our guests today. Elizabeth Way is the assistant curator at the museum at FIT, and she researches the intersection of African American culture and fashion. Elizabeth also has a book coming out called Black Designers and American Fashion, which will be available in summer 2021. Julia Fay Smith is the author of Something to Prove, a biography of Anne Lowe. She can be found at fayswordbasket.blogspot.com. We'll link to her blog and book in the show notes. You can find more links along with images of Anne's work in the show notes on our website at seamwork.com/podcast. You'll also find links and notes from all of our past episodes there. Seamwork Radio is brought to you by the Seamwork community, and you can find us at seamwork.com. If you have a story to share, send us an email at podcast@seamwork.com. We'd especially love to hear stories from those whose experiences often get left out of the conversation, whether because of race, gender identity, sexual orientation, disability, age, or any other reason. Again, that's podcast@seamwork.com. You can find us on Instagram at Seamwork and Seamwork Video on YouTube. And we'd love to invite you to join us at seamwork.com. We have an amazing community there, as well as new sewing patterns and classes each month for our members. Podcast listeners can get 50% off our unlimited membership, which gets you unlimited downloads from our library of over 150 wardrobe-building sewing patterns. Just visit seamwork.com/go/podcast50. You can also find that link in the show notes. That's seamwork.com/go/podcast50. And if you like this podcast, please consider giving us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or the podcast app of your choice. It really helps other people to find the show so they can hear these stories too. Thanks for joining us, and we'll be back with you soon. I'm Sari Mitnick, and this is Seamwork Radio.